20 years of foolishness, ignorance, and gullibility. Call it what you will. I called it the end of my marriage and the end of my world. I would still be in the dark if it weren't for the U.S. Army. It was 2010, and I was supposed to lead a joint university military project to develop a new jet engine. I was supposed to lead a team of 16 geniuses and near geniuses, but first everyone had to pass a military screening. The team included 4 senior PhDs and 12 graduate students of varying levels, all supported by the university's large engineering department. I was concerned that some of the 16 members of my team would have difficulty passing the government screening. After all, people with that kind of intellectual potential are often, to put it mildly, eccentric. I couldn't imagine that the government would have a problem with me, a U.S. Navy veteran with combat experience in the Middle East. To my complete surprise, problems arose when the feds checked my wife's background. It all started when they asked why an employee of the New York State Department of Health was traveling to Montreal every few weeks for the weekend, and I couldn't give them a better answer than the one she gave me when I asked her about it a few years ago. Because she needed to. I trusted my wife completely, and when she told me it was necessary, I didn't think twice. Apparently, they conducted an investigation instead of taking my wife's word for it, and that led them to Philippe Dumont, at first glance a talented artist and respected restorer who was also a member of the Communist Party in Montreal. Apparently, this prompted the feds to conduct a thorough investigation into the relationship between my wife and Dumont. And although they ultimately approved my appointment as team leader, the results of the investigation had consequences for my life. We regret to inform you, Mr. MacDonald, that your wife has been having an intimate relationship with this Philippe Dumont for some time. This relationship has been going on for about 20 years, the federal agent who conducted the meeting told me. What can you say when everything in a 26-year marriage turns out to be not what one partner thought it was? In my case, there was nothing to say. It was a blow to the heart, and the end of most of my life as I knew it. I would have bet a lot of money that I had a wonderful marriage with a woman I considered as beautiful as she was on our wedding day. I would have lost a lot of money if I had known that she had been cheating on me with Dumont for the past 20 years, that my 2 sons knew about it, and that he had actually been living in my house with my family while I was serving overseas in 1990 to 1991. To say I was stunned is an understatement. I met Karen shortly after leaving the Navy. At the time, she was working as a nurse in the health department. We dated for a year, and I discovered that she was not only beautiful, but also intelligent. She was also an excellent listener, and although I am not usually very talkative, I told her probably more than she wanted to know about aircraft carriers and how I made sure the planes could take off. Jet engines are my thing. I don't understand people as well as I understand engines. For some reason, I can communicate with engines in a way I could never communicate with most people. However, Karen was the exception to the rule, and 6 months after we started dating, we got married. We stayed in Albany and bought a large, old 4-story house that needed repairs. 2 years later, our first son, Kevin, was born, and 4 years later, our second son, Oscar. The house was about a 10-minute walk from the university where I worked in the engineering department. I walked to work almost every day. Overall, the MacDonald family lived well, although after Oscar was born, Karen and I began to have problems in our intimate relationship. I felt that Karen was pulling away from me, perhaps due to postpartum depression, but I couldn't convince her to see a psychologist. Then tragedy struck our family. At the end of 1990, I was called up to the Navy Reserve to serve on an aircraft carrier. I don't know how government agents dug up all this dirt 20 years ago, but according to them, Philippe Dumont replaced me in my bed before my unit left the country. They told me they were almost certain that he and my wife had been sleeping together for about a year before that. I wondered if Dumont was the reason Karen had grown distant from me. I also wondered if Dumont was the reason my 2 sons also distanced themselves from me when I returned from Iraq. It seemed like they knew about him and Karen, but they didn't say a word to me. At the time, I assumed Karen had made them keep her secret. The Fed said that Dumonte worked as a restorer in town from 1989 to 1993. Then he returned to Montreal, and that was when Karen's trips to Montreal began. They also told me that Dumonte, who was about 10 years older than Karen and me, was married and had 2 children. Apparently, he and his wife had an open marriage, and he seemed to have a special attachment to my wife. What's more, in 1990, my wife and sons were guests of the large Dumonte family for Christmas. With each passing minute, the situation got worse. When I thought about it, I was stunned that my sweet, innocent wife could not only cheat on me, but was such a good actress that she never gave me the slightest hint. Or was I such a gullible fool that I never noticed? As an engineer, my first reaction was to take a step back and carefully examine all the facts. My second reaction was to come up with several plans of action. The emotional reaction was third in importance because that was my nature in my personal life. Perhaps in the Marine Corps and at work I was a man of action, but in my family life, like many husbands, I often deferred to my wife's wishes. I usually chose what made her happy. Now, in my quietest moments, I had to admit that Karen had been using my love for her against me all these years and seemed to feel no guilt about it. Karen was supposed to leave for Montreal the following weekend, so I had no choice but to pretend that everything was fine for 4 more days until I could leave and be alone. I spent that weekend turning the house upside down, looking for anything that might give me a clue about her affair with Dumonte. To her credit, and to my complete surprise, I found nothing that gave me any clue. By this point, my suspicions had gotten the better of me, and I wasn't going to rest until I got some answers. I needed help, so I turned to an old acquaintance from the Navy. First Lieutenant Billy Pascal was the pilot, and I was sitting in the co-pilot seat of a plane flying to Riyadh for an important meeting I was supposed to attend in early 1991. We were going to finalize our part of the U.S. invasion plans for the Persian Gulf, which was supposed to begin the next day. We took off from the aircraft carrier Eisenhower shortly before sunrise and were flying at supersonic speed at an altitude of over 20,000 feet when the Grumman F-14 Tomcat lost both engines. Inertia carried the plane forward a short distance, but the 43,000 pounds of the aircraft quickly began to fall from the sky. The pilot tried twice to restart the engines, but to no avail. "Time to eject, sir?" the pilot asked in a hoarse voice that betrayed his attempts to remain calm. "Cut the fuel and try again," I said from the second seat. "This is crazy. Do it now!" Then I heard the best sound of my life. Both engines started. That day, bad fuel nearly cost us our lives, and ultimately it was my fault as the person responsible for everything. The emergency supply had not been activated, and the engines started up again, switching to the reserve tank as soon as the main power source was cut off. We immediately returned to the aircraft carrier and fixed the problem on all military aircraft, ultimately saving many lives. This would not have happened if our engines had not stalled and told me about the problem. After changing out of his sweat-soaked flight suit, Pascal swore eternal loyalty to me and said he would be forever grateful for all our years of service together. I never intended to ask him for a favor, but he lived in Syracuse, 5 hours away from Montreal, and I needed first-hand information from someone I could trust. Pascal stayed in touch, and over the years we even visited each other. I asked Pascal to pose as a potential client for art restoration. I wanted him to talk to Dumont and share his impressions of him with me. I needed to understand this man whom my wife loved more than me, if she loved me at all. That question was still unresolved. I was almost certain that she still loved me, perhaps not deeply, but as I had been told, I was a clueless bastard. 2 weeks later, after taking time off work for a secret meeting with Pascal, I was much less foolish and realized that my marriage was beyond saving. He remarked that Dumont, even at 60, was a real ladies' man. He was still tall and thin, with a slight aura of mystery and still handsome. Billy started with dinner and noticed that Dumont was shamelessly flirting with the waitress, who was about 20 years old, throughout the entire meal. When Billy remarked admiringly on this, Dumont admitted that they sometimes met in his studio for a little carnal pleasure. Playing his part to the end, Pascal said that he smiled and winked at Dumont in a conspiratorial manner. This seemed to prompt the artist to talk about his conquests, both big and small. He confessed that he had 4 regular mistresses and hundreds of casual flings, as he and his wife lived in an open marriage. Some women give themselves much more freely than others, Dumonte told Billy. My favorite has practically become part of my family. She even spent Christmas with my family when her husband was away on business. She allowed me to live in her house and sleep with her in her marriage bed, and even convinced her 2 children to keep her secret. Her own children. Can you believe it? She's a cool girl. I still see her from time to time, even after 20 years. But to me, she's just another girl. I've had 4 long-term relationships and probably 100 one-night stands. For a woman to date a man more than once, there has to be some emotional attachment between them. For a man, just seeing her is enough to get aroused. This woman thinks I can walk on water. It took all my self-control not to burst into tears in front of Billy when he told me the abridged version and played the recording he had made secretly. Coincidentally, Philippe Dumont died of a stroke 4 days later. I even managed to see him take his last breath. I must admit that when it happened, I smiled. 20 minutes earlier, I had introduced myself to Dumont. It took him a minute to connect my name with Karen, and then I saw his eyes widen with fear. 20 years later, this bastard thought I was going to beat him up. We sat in silence in the cafe, me drinking coffee and him drinking expensive tea, just as expensive as the tea Karen used to drink. I continued to stare at him silently for about a minute. Have you ever thought about what you did when you stole my wife from me? I asked him seriously. She was everything I had, and you apparently can have anyone you want. But I taught her well, didn't I? He asked. All those poses and movements she told you she learned from books. God, you were such a gullible bastard. It was so easy to make you a cuckold. I started to get up from my chair, but then I changed my mind because I knew time was on my side. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I thought to myself, and smiled as he continued to brag. Dumonte looked confused for about 5 seconds. Then a light bulb went off in his eyes. Then he suddenly grabbed his head as if he had a headache. He slid off the chair and fell to the floor in front of me. I sat there watching, hearing someone call an ambulance. Looks like a stroke, I heard one of the medics say to another about 10 minutes later. Looks like we were a few minutes too late. The news of Dumonte's death reached me at home after my Sunday morning fishing trip. On the kitchen table, I found a note from Karen saying that her friend from Vermont was ill and she would be staying with her for a few days. Karen and I had been married for 26 years, and I never knew she had a friend in Vermont. I knew Karen was going to Montreal for a funeral. I wondered if my sons would go. When she came home 4 days later, she was very quiet. I didn't press her. In fact, I hardly spoke to her. I could see she was hurting, but she was smart enough not to show it. About 10 days later, Karen started complaining that she missed our boys and that the house felt empty. She asked if I would mind if she went to see them for a couple of weeks. I noticed that she didn't invite me to go with her, but I said I didn't mind. The only thing keeping me afloat was my job at the university. The engine ordered by the government had to be powerful enough to launch an aircraft with 80,000 pounds of thrust into orbit. In fact, it turned out to be a complete failure, consuming fuel like a drunken sailor. We, the university, had signed a year-long contract for a huge sum of money. It was so important for the economy and the prestige of the university that the rector even visited the old sports hall where my team worked. On Saturday, I was raking autumn leaves around the house. I started with a light rake, but it had rained the day before and the leaves were too heavy for it, so I went back into the house for a heavier rake. As soon as I entered the garage, the doorbell rang. I entered the house through the side door and walked to the front door. If it hadn't been for the rain and the light rake, perhaps the next act in this strange play that my life had become would not have unfolded. Standing on the doorstep was a petite Asian woman, dressed a little younger and sexier than her age, which I estimated to be 50, like mine. She was wearing an expensive black dress, visible under her coat, and sexy black leather boots with high heels. She looked good for her age and knew it. Although she didn't look like Karen, there was something about her manner that reminded me of my wife. She introduced herself as Avril Dumonte, the widow of the recently deceased artist Philippe Dumonte, and I felt my legs tremble involuntarily. Not only had that bastard stolen my wife's love, but he had also married a damn beautiful woman. I wondered what it all meant. I asked. "I'm looking for Karen," she said, shifting a large rectangular package wrapped in brown paper. "I just stopped by on my way to New York to bring her a painting," she said. "You must be her husband, Robert. Could you help me? It's a little heavy between my car and your front door," she said, stepping over the threshold and trying to lift the painting. I took the package from her and followed her into the house. She headed straight for the large living room, and I realized that her late husband wasn't the only Dumont to have been in my house. She acted as if I should know her. She spoke perfect English with a slight French accent. I sat Mrs. Dumont down in an old armchair that we had inherited from my wife's mother and offered her some tea. She asked for tea, the same expensive brand that my wife and her husband used to drink. "Formosa by how, if you have it. I'm afraid Karen got me used to it," she said. I looked at her from under my eyebrows. She didn't seem to notice. I went to the kitchen and made her tea. I took a beer for myself and returned to the living room. "You're just as handsome as Karen described," Avril said, looking me up and down immodestly. "I'm so sorry we didn't meet sooner, but I understand you work a lot." Apparently, she knew more about me than I knew about her, although I knew some facts from the federal investigation I had read. Avril explained that she was on her way to New York to help organize an exhibition of her late husband's work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and had stopped by to drop off a painting she believed had belonged to Karen. I explained that Karen had gone to California to visit our son, Oscar. "I should have called, I know," she said, "but I'm already here." She began to unpack the bag. It wasn't his usual style, but it was perhaps his best, most inspired work, she said. Of course, he had a wonderful muse. She showed me the painting, which was of her. Light flooded the room from the east-facing window of our house, in the bedroom we had shared for the past 25 years. Judging by the painting, it had been done a few years after the birth of our second son, Oscar, when Karen had not yet lost the weight she had gained during pregnancy. Karen's hazel eyes with a golden hue were perfectly captured, as was the slight smile on her face as she clearly looked at the artist with an expression of unbridled love. It was obvious that although Karen was my wife, she was clearly his woman. I gasped and leaned back in the chair I was sitting in. Avril's proud smile quickly faded. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. It was one thing to read and hear about how Karen had betrayed my love, but it was quite another to see it, to see the real emotions. "Oh, mon Dieu, I've made a terrible mistake," Avril exclaimed. "You didn't know, did you? How could you not know? They lived together for a while. They were lovers for many years. We all thought you knew and approved." "No, I didn't know, at least not until a couple of months ago," I cried, finally unable to hold back my emotions. "But seeing it is much worse. He may have been a brilliant artist, but if he weren't dead, I would have killed him." No, 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 Avril exclaimed. That's not true. It was beautiful. My Philip loved your wife. She stood up from her chair. I stood up too and said sharply that I wanted to hear her side of the love story. You can't just leave me with this painting and walk away. You owe me, I said. The story came out slowly and with difficulty. I made her a second cup of tea and poured myself another pint of beer. I also grabbed a box of tissues because we were both crying. Avril's husband, Philip Dumonte, an art restoration expert, was hired in 1989 to restore 6 paintings damaged by vandals at the Southall Mall in Albany. Shortly after Philippe began working, a romance blossomed between them. He met Karen at Southall Mall while working in the museum building. She worked in the tower. They were practically on the same floor. Evelyn and Philippe lived in an open marriage at her insistence. We were young and didn't want to miss out on anything, but we were mature enough to understand each other's needs, she said through tears. Evelyn was happy that Philip had found someone while traveling. He went to Montreal but spent most of his time in Albany for 3 years. Then, in the summer of 1990, he moved in with me and stayed. Avril visited several times. She knew I had left and was still married to Karen, but she was never told why. She assumed I knew about their relationship and approved of it. I just thought so. She spoke lovingly of you and praised you as a husband and father. I understood that Philip had moved in with you because you couldn't be with her and you had young children. 2 boys who needed a male influence and a lonely woman. We had 2 teenage daughters who were boarding at school. Philip spent their vacations with us. Karen spent Christmas 1990 at our house. My daughters loved her and the boys as much as I did. How could you not know? You don't understand what it means to trust your spouse completely, to believe that he will honor the terms of his marriage vows, I said quietly. I trusted my wife unconditionally, and when I went abroad, I was bound by my duties to try to ensure the safety of as many of my crewmates as possible. Even in my wildest dreams, I couldn't imagine that Karen would betray me like that. When I was abroad, the thought of returning to my family was my only support. I couldn't imagine that she would replace me with another man, and that my sons would support her and continue to do so. I fought in a war, for God's sake, and she was having fun with your idiot husband. No, Robert, you don't understand, Avril replied sadly. Philip was her second man. You were always her first. She loves you with all her heart. He was her older, more experienced lover. Apparently, she didn't have much experience, and Philip was an excellent teacher, as I know, but they were more friends than lovers. When she came to the funeral without you, everyone asked about you, and she said you were fine and that the 2 of you still loved each other very much. Even in my grief, I was happy for her. I brought the painting because Philip always said she should have it. She's gorgeous, isn't she? She's gorgeous, mais oui, I replied, using the few words of French I knew. She completely captured the moment. She's a beautiful girl. Avril realized it was time to go. I knew she didn't want to leave without showing the painting. I'll make sure she sees it, I promised. Please don't do anything stupid until you talk to Karen, she said. I haven't talked to her yet, I replied. I knew Avril would call Karen as soon as I left. Karen cut her trip in half and came to our place the next day after lunch. Although it was Sunday, I was at work, and since I hadn't answered Karen's calls after talking to Avril, I didn't know she was home when I arrived. I realized she was home when I noticed that the painting was missing from the living room. Instead, I saw Karen, who was hugging herself tightly and looked as if she had been crying for hours. I'm so sorry you saw that before we had a chance to talk, she whispered, almost in a whisper. I'm sorry you found out about Philip this way. Actually, I've known about it for several weeks, I replied just as quietly. I just hadn't seen it with my own eyes. She ran into our room, and I heard the door lock. Many years ago, Karen and I had converted the fourth floor into an apartment with a separate entrance and staircase from the street and rented it out to earn some money. Oscar had been renting it from us for the last 2 years of high school, and then when he went to college, I had moved a lot of my stuff there yesterday, so it wasn't a big deal that Karen had locked me out. I looked around the house and found that Karen had hidden the painting in a closet in the back hallway under a blanket. For the next 2 weeks, I practically lived on the fourth floor, coming and going through the fourth floor entrance. On the 15th day, there was a soft knock on the door. "Rob, you know we need to talk," she said. "I made dinner. I'll wait for you in the kitchen." To Karen's credit, her story was mostly consistent with what Everil and the feds had told me. She repeated that she was sorry for hurting me, but she never once said she was sorry for what she had done or for involving our children in the conspiracy. She also didn't seem ashamed of her actions. In fact, she began her story with the words, "This is a love story." "Maybe it's a love story to you," I said quietly. I found a lawyer and asked him to prepare the divorce papers. I would tell her when to file them. A week later, Everil returned to stay with us for a few days. Karen agreed to help her with Philip's exhibition. I was unhappy for several reasons, the main one being that I knew Everil was complicit in the affair. 2 nights later, there was another knock on the door of my fortress of solitude. I knew who it was before I opened it. "You're a stupid, stupid man. If you don't realize that she loves you more than life itself, and that you're causing her terrible pain," Everil said as she walked past me into my room. As usual, she was dressed in a t-shirt and jeans that seemed a size too small but looked good on her slim figure. She was wearing full makeup, and not a hair was out of place. I was sitting there in my boxer shorts, looking like a slob. I apologized and went to get dressed, but she stopped me with a soft command. "No, don't bother. I'm a woman who likes to look at well-groomed men, and you fit that description perfectly." I know I blushed bright red, but I went and sat back down in my lazy boy chair without getting dressed. I felt awkward at the thought that someone liked me. For the next 30 minutes, Everil talked at length about her feelings about the situation. She told me her story about how she was the 4th child of a Japanese military wife and a French-Canadian father. She met Philip on the campus of McGill University, where Philip was a part-time lecturer, an aspiring artist, and practically the prince of the campus. When their romance began, she was a freshman. He was 26, and she was 19. 7 years later, when they already had 2 daughters, Everil began to notice that her husband was looking at other women. She realized she had 2 options: hold on to him with all her might and possibly lose him, or give him more freedom and save the marriage. I realized I had to let him go. I suggested we both date other people. I chose shallow guys who were more physically attractive and less experienced, so he wouldn't feel threatened. I hoped he would do the same, and he did until he met your Karen. She was my worst nightmare. Beautiful, tall, with strawberry blonde hair and magical brown eyes. A combination of sexuality and innocence. After a year, the affair seemed to be coming to an end. She had a husband and 2 small children, and I think she was afraid her husband would find out. But then her husband left, and Philip couldn't leave this woman. Our 2 children were at boarding school, so he moved in with her, and instead of visiting me on weekends, I started visiting him. And I fell in love with her too. I slept with Philip when I visited, and Karen slept with him the rest of the time. I was so happy that they were together. Their love was pure, each wanted the best for the other. She looked me straight in the eye. He could have left her, but he didn't. He stayed with her and her boys until the day her husband came back. I have never been so proud to be Philip Dumonte's wife. He didn't run away when things got uncomfortable. Philip didn't let her down. Her husband let her down. I was openly indignant at her last statement. "I didn't let her down," I practically shouted. "I was drafted into the Marines. I spent almost a year on an aircraft carrier while your husband and my wife played hide and seek." She lowered her eyes to the floor. Apparently, this was new information to her. "We both married passionate people," she said. But it's over. I lost my partner and yours is right down there. We can't change the past. Just love her and move on. She can't stop loving Philip either. I know you agreed to an open marriage, but I didn't. We never discussed it. She made the decision on her own. I had nothing to do with it. Avril stood up when I sat down again. Then she told me about Christmas 1990, when my family went to Montreal to celebrate the holiday with the large Dumonte clan. My boys became close to Avril's daughters, like older sisters. Karen had practically become Aunt Karen to the Dumont girls, Simone and Susan. "Don't you understand?" I said to her. "I'm her husband, but she abused my love for her, abused my trust, because she loved your husband. All these years, he was her first love. I was only second to her." Avril practically collapsed in tears. I picked up her fragile body and carried her downstairs. Karen looked at me strangely as I sat Avril down at the kitchen table and then went back upstairs. About 2 hours later, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Karen, who looked as if she had been crying again. She had come back to apologize for hurting me, but again, not for her actions. She also tried again to tell me that the past was the past and couldn't be changed. "It doesn't matter what you think, Rob. I never stopped loving you. I never took anything of yours and gave it to him. There is room in my heart to love more than one man. You never lost my love." You can say that and even believe it, Karen, but it's not true. You can't love two men equally, and you didn't. You lied to me, even if it was with silence, and you showed disrespect by deliberately breaking our vows. You used my trust against me and turned my sons against me by involving them in your affair. I couldn't stop you from putting him first when he was alive, and now that he's dead, he'll always be first. It's time for you to go, Karen. I've been working hard on this project, and I'm very tired. But you're right. We need to talk about everything. You have to answer my questions. Can we at least wait until the beginning of next year, Rob? She replied. Next week is Canadian Thanksgiving, and then Avril and I have to sort everything out with Philip's exhibition. I promised, and I will keep my promise. If it's for Philip, then of course you'll keep your promise, I said with undisguised disgust. Anger flashed in her eyes, but to my surprise, she said nothing. I knew nothing about this Canadian Thanksgiving, but I didn't think it would affect me much. I started working a lot because the engine just wasn't running. She wasn't talking to me. Like my marriage, that engine had its problems. A few days later, people started showing up at the house, and I was wrong. It did affect me after all. When I came home from work the next evening, a young woman was sitting in my favorite lazy boy chair breastfeeding a baby. I was surprised when I walked in, but she didn't even make an attempt to cover herself. She introduced herself as Simone, Averil's eldest daughter. It turned out that she, her husband George, and their 3 children would be staying in the apartment for the next few days. I needed to find Aunt Karen and find out which room I would be staying in. I snorted, and she looked at me apologetically. I should have guessed that my wife would care more about Philip's family than about me. The established order of things had not changed, and my wife only added to my irritation, although she didn't seem to notice or care. I should have expected something like this. I'll go find my wife, I muttered, more to myself than to anyone else. I went downstairs and found the house full of people. My eldest son, Kevin, with his girlfriend, my youngest son, Oscar, with his boyfriend, Mark, Avril, my youngest daughter, Avril, with her family, 2 grandmothers, 2 uncles, and several cousins. Many of the Dumonte family were engrossed in conversation and barely glanced in my direction. A few people came over, introduced themselves, and said what a wonderful woman Karen had been. I assumed they all knew that Karen had slept with Philip Dumonte. After talking to many members of the Dumonte family, I finally found my wife and learned that we would be sharing one of the back bedrooms. I hadn't slept in the same bed with my wife since she left on her trip, but I decided I could endure it until the relatives left. I didn't know that Everill would be joining us. When I found out, I realized it was a trap. Sex with Everill, or maybe even with both women, was part of a plan to make me forgive and forget, or at least make me forgive. I knew Karen thought I was completely gullible and stupid, but it was more than an insult. To give a poor cuckold a couple of times out of pity, and everything would be fine. I went to bed before the two women entered the room. I had just begun to fall asleep when I felt naked bodies crawl into the bed on both sides. I got out of bed, got dressed, and went back to the hill. I was going to sleep in my study. As I left the room, I heard both women crying softly. The sofa in my study wasn't the worst place I'd ever slept, but even there I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was because of the proximity to the engine. I don't know. But sometime during the night I heard her whispering to me. I found the answer, but it wasn't easy. We had to completely redesign the structure. I got up from the couch and brewed a large pot of coffee. It was 4 a.m. The university had housed our project in our school's old gym. The sports teams had long since moved to a modern stadium. Our monstrous contraption stood where athletes once trained. Now there were 16 or 17 of us living in the building, including me, and none of us were athletes. One of the group members named the engine Persephone after the goddess of the underworld, but after I found out about Karen's infidelity, I started calling it Karen after the goddess of my own underworld. The rest of the group gradually learned about my problems, and soon everyone was calling it Karen. Yes, by that time we were a strange family. News of the new project spread through the group like wildfire, and something new replaced the old. The enthusiasm was more than contagious. It was almost life-affirming. The room was suddenly filled with the atmosphere of a successful beehive. At 11:30, my personal assistant Lisa finally tugged at my sleeve. She pointed to the clock. "Damn, we need to order dinner. Looks like we got carried away," I said. "Rob, it's 11:30 p.m., not a.m., she replied awkwardly. I looked around. Everyone was moving more slowly, but the room was still buzzing with activity. I had to stop everything before I wore everyone out. "Okay, guys, time to wrap it up," I called out. "We'll pick it up tomorrow, but not before noon. Everyone okay with that?" I heard a lot of tired affirmations. "Yes, boss." As I locked the room, I suddenly felt exhausted. Karen, the driving force behind the company, had finally revealed her secrets to me. However, as I drove down the hill, I knew that the other Karen would not be so candid. When I pulled into the backyard, it was dark. "Karen stopped waiting for you. She didn't think you'd come back. What will it take for you to forgive her?" Everill's voice rang out from the porch. "Believe it or not, I was really working. We got stuck at work. The engine finally spoke to me," I replied. "None of you have any idea what I'm working on," I added. "Not even my wife, the person who should be closest to me in the world. I can't talk to her because she's too busy mourning her lover. Her damn lover, for God's sake. Your dead husband is interfering in my life again." I knew I had hurt her because I heard her sobbing, but she didn't answer. At that moment, I didn't care. Evelyn followed me into the bedroom. I undressed and lay down on one side of Karen. Evelyn undressed and lay down on the other side. I guessed she had done this before. This time, the women did not touch each other. The next day, I got up early and went down to the kitchen, where the two grandmothers were busy preparing breakfast. I took a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. A plate of food appeared in front of me as if by magic. Not wanting to appear rude, I began to eat. When I sat down, the grandmothers joined me at the table. "I would say I'm surprised to see you up so early, but there wasn't a sound coming from your room," said Sarah Dumonte. "You have two beautiful women in your bed. Can't you put aside your fragile male pride so that all three of you can be happy?" Sarah Dumonte was 95 years old and the grand dame of the family. She was still sharp-witted, and I could see she didn't believe in ceremony. "Of course, my son took your woman, made her his mistress and a cuckold. Your pain is understandable and justified, but I know that you love your wife with all your heart, and she and Everill can ease your pain if you let them. My son is gone. The past must remain in the past. It is time to move forward and reclaim your women. Karen has atoned many times for her sin of love and need with guilt. She is willing to do anything to relieve you of the pain she has caused you. But we all know that is impossible. Now it is your turn to avoid the next sin, the sin of pride. With all due respect, Karen has not paid for her sin and never will, because she is not to blame for what she did, I replied. Her guilt for hurting me is minimal. Otherwise, she would not have been able to do what she did for 20 years. 20 damn years. Any guilt she felt toward me is long gone. The only thing she feels guilty about is that I found out. They would still be sleeping together if I hadn't found out. And Philip isn't dead, said Madame Dumontet. Yes, that too, I replied quietly. It was Saturday morning. I climbed the hill and arrived at the field house around 11 a.m., an hour earlier than I had told my people. Lisa and 7 others were waiting for me to open the door. The other 8 arrived 5 minutes later. We worked until 9 p.m. Then I sent everyone away and told them the door would not open until 6 a.m. on Monday. 6 is not 5, I called out to them. It's not 5:30 or 5:55. 6 is 6. When I arrived at 9:15, Karen met me at the door. Are you avoiding me? She asked sharply. What do I have to do to get you to forgive me? You're so self-absorbed that you have no idea what I'm working on or what else is going on in my life. I have a multi-million-dollar engine that tells me more than my wife does. Hearing my response, which wasn't harsh, she took a step back. Do we have a chance to be together again? What do you mean, together? I asked. The way we were 2 months ago, or the way we've been for the last 20 years? The same, she replied quietly. I know I looked at her with disbelief written all over my face. The 2 women had been working tirelessly on Philippa's exhibition, which was scheduled to open in mid-January. They had taken a few days off to go to Montreal and spend Christmas with the Dumont family. I had been invited too, but I couldn't go because we were finishing work on the engine. This upset both women. When they returned to Albany on January 2nd, they were thrilled with the final plans for the exhibition. They had contacted everyone who had works by Philippe that they wanted to include in the exhibition. And Karen's painting will be the centerpiece and grace the cover of the program, Everill announced like a child seeing Christmas presents for the first time. She smiled at Karen, and Karen smiled back until they both looked at me. I felt as if I had been punched in the stomach. You can't use that painting, I croaked. Why not? The women asked in unison. Because it shows that Karen was Philip's woman, his mistress. It's bad enough that many strangers will see it and recognize her, but there are also people we know. I'll be humiliated again. Is that what you want? Humiliated again? Karen asked. You have no idea how humiliating it was to hear from 2 federal agents that my wife had lived with some French-Canadian artist for 20 years. To hear that she lived with him in our house, slept with him in our bed. So that's how you found out? Karen exclaimed. Why were they digging into my past? I'm working on a project for the Navy. They were checking everyone. I didn't tell you because I didn't think it was important. But then again, I didn't know you had been cheating on me. For 20 years. I buried my head in my hands. I was suddenly overcome with exhaustion. We have to use this painting, said Everill. It's Philip's best work. He captured a beautiful woman in the prime of her beauty and charm. Please, Rob, for Everill's sake, for Philip's sake, for my sake, don't fight it. Wow. That went right over Karen's head. She didn't even sigh or blush. I turned and left the room. The small chance we had of continuing this marriage was gone. A few minutes later, I was walking up the hill to the field house. On the way, I called my lawyer and asked her to file for divorce as soon as she could. A couple of days later, government officials came to take the engine. There were only 2 days left before launch. My team was in despair when I told them that our creation would no longer belong to us. I called the university president to see if she could intercede on our behalf. "How much of it do you own?" she asked. "Everything except the original design. Karen belongs to us," I replied. Karen?" stammered the president. "You named it after your wife? You're all a little out of your minds, aren't you?" "I named it after my soon-to-be ex-wife. At least one of my women will do as expected," I replied. "I'll give you 2 days. Get to work." I told my team we had 48 hours to launch. An hour later, government security showed up to keep an eye on us. We launched the project 15 minutes before the deadline. None of the team had slept or been home in over 2 days. When we finished shouting and screaming, I turned on my phone for the first time in 2 days. There were several terse messages from Karen and Everill. Apparently, Karen had received notification in my absence. After that, the president and the feds took over. They took our IDs and keys. As we left the gym, we were handed hefty bonus checks. My excitement turned to exhaustion as I walked down the hill. I didn't even try to sneak into the building through the 4th-floor entrance. I walked in through the front door, and Karen and Everill practically pounced on me as I entered. "We didn't stand a chance, did we?" Karen shouted at me in anger and disappointment. "Just like I didn't stand a chance after you first slept with Philip," I shouted back. I shouted back at her. "Tell me after that, did you ever want to be with me when you were sleeping with him?" She stared at me blankly. "Now tell me, how many times did you want to be with him when you were with me?" She blushed and stared at the floor. I got my answer, and it wasn't a surprise. "You were his woman from the moment he took you. I was always just a backup for you. Maybe you feel some kind of love for me, but it's not even close to what you tell me in yourself," I growled. "The saddest thing is that I loved you with all my heart, and to him, you were just a pretty, easy girl, one of 4, as far as I know." "You don't understand," she shouted at me. "Your little male ego is blind to the truth." If she wanted the truth, I would give it to her, unvarnished. I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the voice recorder and pressed play, having waited a long time for this moment. Philip's voice came to life, and Karen and Everill froze in shock. "They say men think below the belt," Philip said. "But everyone knows that a woman's heart is tied to her body, and your wife is no exception. She was easy to get into bed, and after 3 or 4 times of satisfying her, she became my mistress. She was an excellent lover, I admit, but still only a mistress. I didn't love her, but I loved having sex with her. If you want her back, poof, she's yours." I closed the app, put my phone in my pocket, and left the 2 women standing there in silent shock. "You're a stupid, stupid woman," I whispered as I went up to my apartment to get my things. After thinking it over, Karen decided not to use the painting Philip had painted for her in her exhibition. Not surprisingly, Karen and Everill are no longer together. The sun rose and the test flights were over. The new plane, named Karen by the eccentric team that built it, didn't look like a contender for the title of America's next-generation fighter jet, but it flew higher and faster than any other plane tested in the previous days. No one from the university was present at the tests. In the end, both of my sons apologized to me for helping Karen deceive me. I forgave them. They were in a bad situation and made a bad choice. Oscar was the first to come back to me. I don't think he knew what I had found out about him and Mark when his mother and I started having problems, but Oscar almost fainted on Canadian Thanksgiving when I asked Mark about his plans for my son's future. "You never cease to amaze me, Dad," he said then. He and Mark got married about a year later. I was a proud father. Kevin and I had to go through a longer process to get closer. As the older son, he was the one Karen relied on most at first to keep her secret. Apparently, he figured out that the new man in our house wasn't just a guest, but my replacement. He confessed to me that he knew he was doing wrong, but felt compelled to keep her secret because I wasn't there, and Karen was. He also confessed that he would have continued to lie for Karen's sake to keep our family together. For a while, he resented me for not forgiving Karen and staying with the family. Things got complicated for Kevin when he finally got into a serious relationship with a woman. He and the woman who eventually became my sister-in-law were together for almost 2 years, and it didn't seem like Kevin was ever going to propose. One day, she called me in tears and said she didn't want to break up with Kevin, but she wasn't going to wait forever for him to propose. Last week, she called my ex-wife, but Karen couldn't help her, she said. I told her I would call him. Kevin wasn't surprised that I was calling him about Lauren, even though we never discussed his personal life. Obviously, Karen had called him last week about Lauren, so he put 2 and 2 together when I called. I can't, Dad. I just can't, he finally admitted. I know what Mom did to you for 20 years, and I don't want that life. At first, I knew you didn't know, but after a while, it seemed like everyone knew. And I decided you knew too. And I lost respect for you for letting Philip just walk away with Mom. Then I found out that you really didn't know, and that she had been playing you like a fool all these years. I hated you. Then I felt sorry for you. I'm sorry, Dad. I promise you, Kev, not all women are like your mother. Please don't let her example ruin your life and Lauren's life. Please get help. Later, I learned that the therapist Kevin had chosen had met with Karen several times on Zoom. I didn't know about this until one evening when Karen called, one of the few times I had spoken to her since our divorce 4 years ago. Did you know Kevin was thinking about suicide after our divorce? Karen asked, almost whispering into the phone. He blamed himself for our divorce and for you fighting with him for so many years. I'll never forgive myself if Kevin hurts himself or, God forbid, kills himself. I never thought it was just me, and probably you too. You mean you never thought it was just what was between your legs, I said. You tried to convince me that your affair was an epic love story. I think it was actually a Greek tragedy, and you dragged our whole family into the mud. Okay, I understand, Karen said sadly. I was a stupid, selfish woman. Kevin and Lauren got married 6 months later. My first grandson was born about a year after that. Little Bobby is my heart. I don't think Philip's artistic legacy helped Avril pay her bills, and to help her former sister-in-love, Karen accepted an anonymous offer of $50,000 for her painting on the condition that it would never be displayed in public. Oscar told me that Avril cried like a baby when Karen gave her the money. Oscar, Mark, Kevin, Lauren, and Bobby sat with me, enjoying drinks and snacks by my outdoor fire pit. The fire burned brightly. It seems that canvas and oil paints burn well. Best money I ever spent.